we face in life. Specifically, I'd like to welcome you to Pursuing Restoration, a series of live web events sponsored by the Redeemed, featuring insights and advice from some of the region's most dynamic speakers, each from diverse backgrounds and experiences, offering wisdom and insights into life's challenges and how we can recover and heal from the problems we may encounter. This evening, I'm proud to present a dear friend, the Reverend Dr. Shane Green, Senior Minister at St. Paul United Methodist Church in Columbus, Georgia. Shane will be speaking about men's need for validation from certain important figures in their lives and the wrong turns they take when they don't receive it. Along with this, he will also be talking about how we can better know ourselves and each other through self-reflection and Christ love. Shane, I'd like to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Paul. It's good to see you, and definitely glad to be a part of the Redeem and to share from my own experience and then just things that I've observed in ministry for over 20-something years now. And so when we talk about restoration, in order to talk about pursuing restoration, maybe it's proper to begin at why we need restoration in the first place. And that revolves around certain levels of validations, validations that every person needs in their life. And so if we talk about it from a man's perspective, definitely validations that each and every male need to receive in their life, beginning early on in their development. And so when we talk about validation, we want to talk about it in a couple of different ways by the needs that an individual, a man needs. One of them is that they need certain validations that are both tied to, say, verbal, their words and their actions. It's validations where maybe an older person can convey on them and recognize certain things inside of their life that maybe at that particular age they cannot. Early on, children are wonderful observers. They're not the best interpreters. And young people, they're not born with the sense of self-awareness. Self-awareness in young people, or in anybody for that matter, is something that is acquired. It's something that's learned. It's similar to maturity. We grow into it. And so having someone to validate you, having someone to say, I recognize this about you, either who you are or recognize what you're doing, and I see something in you that you're growing into a fine man or a fine adult. I mean, those are the things that every person needs, but a man definitely needs it, and often needs it from other people. So there's certain validations and words that it also needs to be accompanied with actions. They need to be consistent, and it's not an either or. I remember when I was in seminary, I had a professor named Don Boyd, and Don was he was a preaching professor and a worship professor, and he was helping us hone our skills as young preachers and worship leaders. But I think his task in life was not just to teach us about preaching and worship leading, as much it was to teach us about being good adults. And I remember he would tell a story about from time to time about his own life. And he told one story one day that at first it just flew over my head and I dismissed it. But I'm glad that I've constantly reflected upon it, because the more I've reflected on this story, I thought how spot on this is. And it was one spring day, he was talking about preaching, and then he said, talked about preaching being, it has to come out of who you are as a person. And he said, I've reached the point, and my son has reached the point in his life, that when it comes to our vacations, he plans the vacations and he drives the car. And again, at first it was sort of over my head. I dismissed it. But what he was saying was that knowing who he was in his family, that he was the patriarch of the family, that he didn't want that mantle to pass to his son when he was gone, that his son had reached an age that it was time for him, through different words and actions, to receive that level of validation. And so he adopted a pattern that even when he was still working, that his son was at an age where it was his time to drive the car. He drove the family. He planned the family vacation. So there's something that every man needs in their life that has to do with validations. Part of that validation is from word and action. And it needs to be multiple times. So it's not just certain validations. Those validations have to happen at certain times. And those times are going to be dependent upon each family or each relationship. Now, obviously, there are times in our society that make this easier. When someone's 16, when someone's 18, when someone's 21. And then there are times that are not necessarily related to age, but like at graduations, or maybe if one chooses to be married. But there needs to be unique times that are tied to individual families, that are tied to individual relationships, so that one generation can convey to the next that they see certain qualities or they see certain actions that are taking place in the younger generation that then the older generation can confer and to validate. I have a good friend of mine who lives in a different city, and I thought he had a wonderful idea that he did with his sons. When each son graduated from high school and before they traveled to college, he created a weekend experience for them where he took 5 individuals that were important to the son, five influential men that were maybe close to the family or part of the extended family unit. And they went away for a weekend. And on that particular weekend, each one of those influencers had an opportunity to spend with my friend's son. And so they were able to say to my friend's son, to validate the certain qualities that they saw in him that were developing, and some of the actions that this young man had already what already happened in his life, and things that he was doing, and how they could recognize that and can validate that. Because again, young people aren't always the best when it comes to self-awareness. Self-awareness is something that is acquired. So when someone else can recognize that about you or about another person, it begins to create a sense of identity that can lead to wholeness, and definitely can lead to restoration. And then it needs to come from certain people. Now, obviously, inside of a family, that's best, or inside of an extended family, but it's not limited to just a family. The people who can give validation to another generation, it needs to be a person of influence. And what I mean by that, it needs to be a person of influence that the young person deems to be important. I have 2 children, and I have a daughter, and I could tell you that for my daughter, that her music teacher is a person of influence. So it doesn't necessarily have to be from a family unit or an extended family. It just needs to be someone that the child or the adolescent or the young person recognizes as a person of influence. So we need certain validations. We need them at certain times, and we need them from certain people. Now, what happens in a son's life or in a young man's life when a son does not receive those types of validations, then normally they revert to 2 different outcomes, and they're classical in nature. One could be the outcome of the rebel, where one rebels against what their life is like, and they seek to find fulfillment and wholeness from things that are external. And there are classical things inside of our society that we could use to describe these different vices, things that someone needs from the outside to maybe fill the voids that exist on the inside. But then there's another type of outcome that often is embraced by people or men when they don't receive certain validations that they desired and desperately needed. And that is what I call conformity. And that is where they adopt a style of life that is something that they think they should do, but it comes out of a sense of obligation and not out of a sense of their identity of who they are. And with that, over time, can lead to a sense of displacement in who they are as a person. And it sort of can become a crockpot experience where they hold it in, hold it in, hold it in. And then conformity over time can lead to levels of destruction in their own life. One of my favorite theologians of the 1900s is a guy by the name of Thomas Merton. And Thomas Merton wrote this about rebellion and conformity. He said that we have the choice of 2 identities: the external mask that we present, the external mask that we think is real, and then the hidden inner person who seems to us to be nothing, but who can give himself eternally to the truth. So we didn't have the experience of the validations that we needed and that we craved early on in our life. And so it leaves in us identity voids. And we seek to fill them either through conformity or we seek to fill them through levels of rebellion. But what we do is we create projections where we project to the world what we think we want them to see, what we think they will value, but it's not our real self. And to the degree that there's that level of difference between what we progress and who we actually are, that is where the struggle is for us. We project to others what we want them to see, but seldom is it our real selves. Now, the good news is that we're not destined to be like this forever, and that we're not conditioned or destined to be in this state of reality or status quo, that the future has not yet been written, and that people can change. But I have to tell you, to the degree that one did not receive those certain validations at certain times from certain people of influence, that is directly related to our path to restoration, how long it might be, and even how painful it might become. But the good news is that we can change, and there is restoration that sits for all of us. And I think here it's where faith can be very effective and influential in our own life. It can be most helpful because in our relationship with God, there's the ability for our nature to change. Thomas Merton would go on to write, he said that the secret of my full identity, my real identity, is hidden in him, talking about God. And he, God alone, can make me who I am, or rather who I will be when at last I fully begin to be in him. But unless I desire this identity and work to find it with him and in him, that work will never be done. And so this work of God that has this ability to change our nature, classically inside the church, we use two theological terms to describe this. One is the word that we call justification, and that's an objective act of God, an objective work of God, where God changes our status. He deems us to be worthy. He changes our status to something that's holy, that even when we don't think that we are. It's something objective. God does this. It's instantaneous. But there's another work of God, and that is the word that we call sanctification. And just as justification is something that God alone does, sanctification is something that we do with God. So we live into that nature that God has already deemed. But the good news is that God has this, when we are in God, we have this ability for our nature to change. So how does that change? Let's talk a little bit about the journey of a changed nature. And the first step to that, if you'll grant me those terms, is that it has to begin with honesty. And honesty often is painful, particularly painful when we have to put our finger on those areas of our life where either we've acted out in rebellion or we have adopted this level of conformity to the point to where it is not who we are. And we've created these levels of projection where we project to the society one thing, but it's not who we are. Thomas Merton would go on to say the first step toward finding God, who is truth, is to discover the truth about myself. And if I have been in error, then this first step to truth is the discovery of my error. We stumble and fall constantly, even when we are the most enlightened. But when we are in spiritual darkness, and this is key, even when we are in spiritual darkness, we do not even know that we have fallen. We are not at peace with others because we are not at peace with ourselves. And we are not at peace with ourselves because we are not ultimately at peace with God. Honesty has this wonderful ability to shine the light on things that are dark, to shine the light on things that are hidden, to shine the light on what we present to the world and project, and the difference with who we really are. So when we talk about the idea of our nature changing, we talk about the idea of restoration. The first step towards restoration has to begin with honesty. One of my favorite stories in the New Testament is the story of the prodigal son, Luke chapter 15. And To give you a thumbnail sketch of the story, it's about a father who has two sons, and the younger son, and really an act of taboo, goes to his father and basically tells his father that you're dead to me. I want my level of inheritance right now. And immediately he takes his inheritance and he runs to what the scriptures say is a foreign land. And he begins to live his life in acting out the projection, what he presents to the world, this idea of the rebel. And he eventually comes to a point where that is not fulfilling for him. And he comes to his senses, and he eventually turns and goes back to his father, not as a son, but the idea that he's going to be a slave or a servant. And the moment he steps foot at home, the father immediately receives him in and restores him into full sonship. But the story doesn't stop there. There's another part of the story where we have the older son, or the brother to the younger son, and he's out in his whole life. He's been living this life of conformity, and he's out working in the family business and on the family farm, and eventually he makes his way at the end of the day back up to the house, and he hears all the celebration, and he asks what's going on, and they begin to tell him that the younger son has returned, has been fully restored, and immediately he's irate. And also, in an act of taboo in the ancient world, he does not go into the party, which would have been offensive to the father. It would have been offensive to the entire community. And yet the father leaves the party and he travels to the older son. And immediately the older son rakes the father over the coals and begins to talk about all the things that he did. And he defines himself even in those acts of conformity. I've always worked for you. I've never done anything wrong. I've always done what everybody has asked of me. And yet on the inside, what he's presented to the world is nowhere near his real sense of self. And so what we find in the story is that the younger son, in his level of honesty, he is able to put his finger on his action. He is able to say that this is who I am, this is what I've done, and he doesn't hide from the truth. Because honesty has this ability to shine the light on the things that are dark. Now, what's unfortunate is that we don't know what happens to the older son. But at least at the end of the story, there's not yet this level of honesty for the older son yet. Now, what I would hope is that the story there would be a level of extension where the son does use this as an opportunity to be honest with himself. There is no levels of restoration of wholeness without first a level of honesty. C.S. Lewis said that God whispers to us in our pleasures, and he speaks to us in our conscience, but he shouts to us in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And so when we're willing to be honest, sometimes brutally honest with who we are, levels of projection that we've presented to the world, that are vastly different than who we really are on the inside. Honest that we've adopted a life of rebellion, or the idea that we've adopted a life of conformity. When we're able to be honest, it has this ability to bring everything out in front of us, and that begins our path and journey towards restoration. Another step in this journey towards restoration is the idea of what we would call maybe renouncing old ways. Classical language might be repentance. We often think of that as in actions that we commit. It's actually more of a disposition of the heart. See, in order to be open, we have to renounce ourselves. In the sense, we have to die to our image of ourselves, to our own sense of autonomy, to our fixation on what we've presented and projected to the world as if that's who we really are. And so as we begin levels of restoration, this journey back towards restoration, it starts with honesty. And then we also take a step that has to do with renouncing or turning from what we used to be into something that's more. That first is a disposition of our heart, more so than it is an action that we commit. Now, actions will come, but it first starts on the inside. Authentic living is learning to live from the inside out, not the outside in. And so then maybe a third step that we would take would be is to develop a new pattern If we're able to identify who we are through our levels of honesty, if we have this ability to create a disposition of our heart where we want to change, we want to seek, we want to be something different, then we need to develop new patterns, patterns that replace old patterns. Here, things like disciplines or maybe working with trusted friends, accountability groups. One of my hopes and prayers for the Redeemed ministry is that this would be a place, a safe place for people as they seek restoration, that they would find a way to embrace new patterns in their life. Those can be incredibly helpful in the journey. But it starts with that there are times where we don't receive the validations that we want. And what we do then is we then revert to two different outcomes, a life of a rebel or a life that lives of conformity. And then in doing so, we present to the world one thing, but who we are on the inside is vastly different. Restoration is about both of those coming together, and we living out of who we are, not out of what we think people, not out of what people think we should be. So there is hope for us. There is a journey that we all can travel, that we all can find restoration for our life, for our souls, for our identity. It comes with honesty. It comes with turning from, turning to, and then to develop new patterns for life. So, Paul, I've talked a fair amount now for a number of minutes, and there's a lot in that works of God, works that we do. And I look in our chat area and I see that there's a number of questions. And so maybe it's time for us to devote some time to some Q&A.
Great, Shane. Let's go ahead and read that first question out. How does validation from women figure into a man's journey? I guess what I'm trying to say is, how is the validation from a father, grandfather, or coach different from the validation from a mother, grandmother, or teacher?
Yeah, so what we don't want to think is that they're in dichotomies, that there's a level of where it's only a man giving validation to another man, maybe an older man giving validation to a younger man. Actually, what a person needs, and a male needs this, is validation from both sides of the house. They need validation from a man, but they also need validation from a woman. And in this case, maybe a mother. If I had to just sort of walk through maybe a young man's development, probably early on in their life, the mother's role is probably more important than the father's role. Mothers early on in child development, they're a greater influence in creating an environment that where the child perceives safety, where the child perceives security, where the child perceives love. And so then that creates a foundation for their life early on, particularly in child development. When we talk about a male from, say, moving from a boy into early adolescence, and then from early adolescence into adulthood, that's where the role of man to man, or say father to son, where the father's role becomes more the influence than, say, more of the mother's role. But there needs to be a balance from both sides. It's not an either or, it's a both and. And particularly a mother's role, I just talked about what it's like early on in a child's life. But even when they move into adolescence, a young man forms how he interacts with other people, whether it be with other men or whether it be from other women, from both sides of the house. And often he learns what it's like to, from the female's perspective or from the woman's perspective, how to engage and to interact with the opposite sex, often from his mother or from his grandmother or maybe a woman of influence. So it's not an either or, it's a both and. It's just at different points in their life, one becomes the majority influencer and one becomes the minority influencer. But what leads to the greater sense of wholeness is where both are working together.
Shane, there's some great questions coming up. This next one
Okay.
here, I'm glad you spent some time focusing on the good son and the prodigal son story, because he kind of got the short shrift whenever we talked about that story in Bible school. I feel like he's someone a lot of men in the middle age can relate to, someone who worked hard and followed all the rules, but doesn't feel like he got him anywhere.
Yeah, the truth is, Paul, if I had to, from just my observations in ministry, um, the, the rebel might be something that one plays early on in life, and then through life experiences, hopefully through faith and community, they're able to move into a different place where that's not their style of life. But the majority of men, at least men that I come in contact with, and even some of the things that I even struggle with even today, is I would classify us as we're the older son. And this level of conformity that we live by what we think we should do, the product that we create, and at the same time, it's trying to balance that with that's really not who we are. And so there's some things that we can learn from the older son that I think is helpful in bridging the gap between what we project to the world and who we actually are. In the older son, if you're familiar with that particular passage, the older son over time becomes incredibly bitter. He becomes angry. He becomes resentful. And if you're not familiar with the passage, I hope that you will find a scripture or even Google it up later on today. It's Luke chapter 15. It's the latter part of the passage at the very end of the chapter. And if you just read the language of how he engages his father, it's anger language, and it's bitterness, it's resentful, because he perceives himself to be forced to live a life of conformity. So what we can learn from the older son, and what I've learned in my own life from the older son, is that when I have when I have that sense of anger, or maybe if there's levels of resentment or even something as bitterness, those are wonderful indicators about our own life. And maybe what we're projecting one thing, but who we are is something else. And if you find that, and the only person who will know that will be the individual. If on the inside there's anger or maybe resentment or even maybe bitterness, the book of Hebrews calls bitterness a root of bitterness. And anger and resentment are symptoms of bitterness. That they're indicators for us to ask the question, why? Why do we feel this way? Why do we think this way? Why is not the best question to ask of another person, because it puts the person in a defensive posture. For instance, you just go up to someone and say, well, hey, why did you do this? Immediately, they're probably going to respond in some level of defense. But why is the perfect question to ask of ourselves? Shane, why are you angry? Shane, why do you have resentment? Or Shane, why are you bitter? What that does is that exposes that there's a disconnect from what we're presenting to the world of who we think the world thinks we should be and who we really are. And so the older son, he, obviously there's more language, Paul, that in the text that has to deal with the older son, just because of the point that Jesus was trying to convey to his audience. But there's a wealth of knowledge in that passage about the older son, I think, that is more applicable today for men than it is the younger son. And I would look for those tales where we are aligned with the older son, normally around levels of anger, around levels of resentment, and maybe even levels of bitterness.
That's powerful. Thank you. You focused a lot on anger and resentment. And when I think about men in their middle ages, many of them come to a place where they start to realize they're truly unhappy. And then as a result, they end up going and blowing things up. And in the process, they end up hurting a lot of people. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about how people can reconcile with what they've done without creating a level of damage that impacts other people.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the phrase blowing things up, and I mean that's a powerful image, and it's often an image that is it's extremely true in a number of our lives. And so when we talk about when things are either broken or blown up, for lack of better words, we have to acknowledge that whenever we are in a relationship, there are bonds that are formed, there's love, there's trust, things like that. And so often when those things, when those bonds are broken, then there's some very real pain that exists. And so when we talk about reconciliation, if we mean reconciliation from me reconciling with another person that maybe that I was either in relationship with or currently in relationship with at the time, then we need to understand that reconciliation in that form requires both parties working together, working towards a common goal. And that level of reconciliation might or might not take place because obviously it involves multiple parties working together for a common goal. And there's some things that you cannot control about the other party. So if we're talking about reconciliation in that level, then we need to know that there's limits to that level of reconciliation because it's relational. It involves reconciliation inside of a relationship with another person. So that's one level of reconciliation. There's another level of reconciliation that is completely in the control of the individual. And this is, there's so much that we can't control in life. What we can control is our choices. We can control how we choose to respond. And then with this level of reconciliation, that's a first person action. So again, it starts with honesty. The idea of honesty with what has happened. Often when there is pain involved in when things have gone south or blown up, there's a tendency inside of us to either justify or either to practice denial or maybe to blame shift and things of that nature. And so reconciling the choices that have been made and the consequences of those choices to our own sense of self, again, that's where honesty can be very helpful. It's honesty and understanding that there have been choices that we've made, either things that we've said or actions that we've committed that have led to levels of brokenness and either pain in our own life or pain in another person's life. So with at least, again, light shining on what has happened, where we are honest with ourselves, with what we've done, as painful as that is, that's the first step that helps us. Then at the same time, there can then be forgiveness. And so this is where that reconciliation, where we reconcile with ourselves with the things that we've done and either the consequences of those actions. That level of reconciliation, which began looking with honesty, then comes with a level of forgiveness. But you can't get to forgiveness without first being honest. And so forgiveness, often it's easier to forgive other people than it is to forgive ourselves. I can tell you that's true of me. Can be very gracious and forgiving towards other person, but particularly people, high functioning, type A people, learning to forgive people, that perfectionism, things like that, learning to forgive ourselves, that is incredibly difficult, which is where we need the work of God. There's something wonderful about the work of God, and it's the reason why I'm a Christian. It's the reason why I'm a pastor, is the ability of what God can do with our past experience and with the choices that we've made and the actions that we've committed and then the effects of that. It's not that those things ever go away. So whenever we talk about forgiveness, we need to debunk this idea that forgive and forget. That is so illogical. Because the more you try to forget, actually the more you're going to remember. So what we're after is really a level of forgiveness of ourselves, where those things that we are aware of what has happened. We are very mindful. We don't deny it. We don't justify it. We don't run from the choices that we've made. But what we do is we allow the work of God through the Spirit to take that event and to remove the venom from them, so we're not plagued by them anymore. That is a level of forgiveness that takes place where we're able to forgive ourselves. I think that work of God is when we really see what we present to the world and who we are. I think that's when that mask is brought closer to actually to who we are, and we live authentically from the inside out. And so again, starts with honesty. We invite God into the pain, into the process. God, through the work of the Spirit, helps us to forgive ourselves. And then from that, we want to start a new pattern. So there are other examples of this, like 12-step programs. I mean, the idea of making amends, the idea of embracing service to other people. If you're familiar with the 12-step process, I mean, making amends, I think that's like step 7. So it's well into the process of restoration. It's well into the process of reconciliation. But we do want to seek to make amends to what levels we can control. Again, when it involves other people, we cannot control how they'll respond. We can just control what we can contribute to that process. But then I do want to encourage people who are watching tonight that if you find yourself in this type of situation, to embrace a level of service. There's all types of benefits from service, even if you take out the faith component. But I've witnessed in my own life, I've witnessed in thousands of people's lives, what happens when people serve. It's a beautiful picture. They're able to reframe who they are through the lens now of this new pattern that they're creating, where they're giving of themselves, and they begin to see themselves in that light and not see themselves strictly from the light of past mistakes. It can take place. It begins with honesty. It begins with forgiveness, which is where we invite God into those painful choices that we've made and the effects of it. And then we allow God to take the venom out, to render those things neutral, where they don't have this sense of control over us. Now, forgiveness takes time, so it's process oriented, but it is a reality that we can live into. And then to sort of reinforce that through new patterns that we create in our life.
Well, thank you, Shane. We got time for one more question. Let's go back to the audience. How would you respond to someone who says, if I haven't gotten validation from my parents, teachers, coaches, etc., there's no way that I'm going to receive it from God?
Yeah, so obviously, Paul, now, when there's validation that is incarnational, what I mean by that, it's flesh to it, where there's a person who can either commit the action or say the words to us at a certain time. I mean, that's actually would be ideal. But I do want to just implant and raise hopefully the issue with those that are watching, is that God's work is not dependent upon what a person can or cannot do. And so often what I do inside of my own ministry as the minister, one of the ministers here at St. Paul, is when I'm asked this question is to say, can you at least begin with the possibility that you'll leave the door open for what God can do? Even if you don't know how that's going to play out, even if you're skeptical, if you would just leave the door open for 6 months or a year, and then give God the opportunity to reveal and to manifest himself inside of their life so that they can receive the validation that they crave and that they desperately want. Now, that doesn't mean that we just sit on our hands and we don't pursue it. So we put ourselves in either an environment, we seek after it, which means we might adopt a certain different types of prayer, a prayer life. We might read, we might adopt levels of reflection. We might put ourselves in a community, even a community like the Redeemed, where we're exposed to opportunities that just where that door can be open, even it is to the slightest of degrees, so that God can reveal himself. God's work, what's so beautiful about God to me is God has the ability to reach into our time and space, even when we think that he can't, or even when we haven't witnessed it in other people. That God's work is independent of, it's not dependent upon. Now, God might use other people to help us in that endeavor, but there's an ability of God that is able to break in through the role of his Spirit. To John Wesley said it this way, one of my favorite theologians. So there's one way that we can receive validation and know, and that's really logic based. If something says A plus B plus C equals D, and we see that take place in our life, then we can conclude that has happened. He said that so there is a level of reason that helps us. He said, but that is far inferior to the work of what God can do, where God's Spirit says to our spirit, yes, you are my son, or you are my child, or in you I am well pleased. So what I would hope that those that are watching tonight is that you would at least leave the opportunity for a period of time, 6 months to a year, to allow God to manifest himself in such a way to validate, to create in you a sense of identity that is based in him, where we live from the inside out and not the outside in.
Well, thank you, Shane. We appreciate you coming on, sharing your wisdom and insight. And it's an incredible gift to everybody who's on the podcast today. I want to also thank all of our audience members who've come on. Thank you for the dedication of your time, for being with us. For those of your friends and family who may want to watch this, but weren't able to come on the call today, we are going to actually have a link sent to you. Also want to let you know that we're going to be doing this again on July 30th. We'll have Jeff Struker at 6 p.m. He's got a fascinating story. He's one of America's heroes. And I'd love to have you come on our show one more time. Thank you all again. Please look at us on social media. We're on Facebook. We're on Twitter. We're on Instagram. And also take a look at our website. Please sign up for our newsletter. We'd love to have you. Thank you, everyone, and good night.